Nobody on this beach has ever heard the name Peter. Not one person. Not the men coiling rope beside him. Not his brother. Not his wife. The most famous fisherman in human history is standing 40 feet from you with a folded net over his shoulder. And the name you know him by does not exist yet. Not as a name, not for him, not for anyone alive. Here he is, Simon. Simon, son of Jonah, if you need to be precise. Because there are other Simons in a village this size, and a patronymic is how you tell working men apart. Peter is a word that will be handed to him later by someone who has not yet walked into this story. Tonight he is simply late, and the light is going off the water. You are standing in Capernaum, on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, somewhere in the 3rd decade of the 1st century. Tiberias is emperor in Rome and will be for years yet. Galilee is not a Roman province, and there is no Roman legion within 100 miles of this water. That is a picture borrowed from later centuries, and it does not belong here. This district belongs to Herod Antipas, a client ruler who holds it at Rome's pleasure, and the soldiers who occasionally come through this town are his. The stone under your feet is black. That matters more than it sounds. Nazareth, 30 miles west, is built out of pale limestone. And if you have pictured Capernaum as a sun-bleached white village, you have pictured the wrong town entirely. This is volcanic country. The houses are stacked from rough basalt, dark and heavy and unshaped, walls a meter thick because undressed stone will not hold up a second story. Doorways are low, streets are narrow and unpaved. Roofs are beams and branches packed with earth, which is why a determined man could later open one up. The houses are not freestanding, either. They cluster around shared courtyards, several families opening onto the same square of packed dirt, where the oven stands and the grinding stone stands, and most of the actual business of living gets done. Privacy, as you understand it, does not exist here. Simon's family, his brother's family, his wife's mother, all of them are inside one of these clusters, sharing one fire and one door to the street. And the whole village smells of fish. Not the smell of a market stall, the smell of an industry. Brine and drying nets, and the pitch used to seal hulls, and wet rope, and smoke. On a still day, when the air comes up the shore from the south, you can catch the salting yards at Magdala, 6 miles down the coast, where the catch of this entire lake is preserved for export. The Greeks called that town Tassels, and the word simply means the place where things are salted. That is what the Sea of Galilee was, commercially. Not a landscape, a food factory. Simon walks down to the water and the light is almost gone, and that is not bad timing. That is the shift starting. You should understand this water before you get into a boat on it. The lake sits in a hole. Its surface lies roughly 210 meters below sea level, which makes it one of the lowest bodies of fresh water on Earth, and the effect is a climate of its own, a basin of trapped heat ringed by high ground. 21 kilometers long, 13 across at the widest. From this beach, you can see the far shore on a clear day, which means you can also see weather coming, and every man here has trained his eye to do exactly that. Because the other thing this basin does is manufacture storms out of nothing. Cold air spills off the heights to the east and funnels down through the ravines, and it strikes water that has been flat and warm all afternoon, and within minutes there are waves where there was a mirror. That is not legend, that is meteorology. Every fisherman on this shore has lost someone, or nearly been someone, and the competence that keeps a family fed is mostly the ability to read a sky in the dark. Now the boat. We know what it looked like, and we know because of a drought. In 1986, the lake dropped far enough to expose a hull in the mud near Genosar, and what came out of the silt was a fishing boat from this exact period. Radiocarbon dating places it in a window running from the last decades before Christ into the middle of the 1st century. It was about 8 meters long and a little over 2 wide. It would carry a working crew of a handful of men and a catch. Here is the detail that tells you the most. The hull had been built with proper joinery, mortise, and tenon, and then repaired, and repaired again, and repaired again, with more than a dozen different kinds of wood. Whatever was available, whatever could be scavenged and shaped and driven into place, patched into a boat that someone kept alive long past the point where a wealthy owner would have replaced it. That is not Simon's boat. Nobody can say that, and nobody should, but it is a boat from his water, in his lifetime, and what it testifies to is a trade where the equipment was expensive, the margins were thin, and nothing was ever thrown away. 8 meters. Stand in that. Now put 5 men in it, and a mast, and a stone anchor, and a wet seine net that takes up most of the floor, and do it in the dark, on water that drops away beneath you to 40 meters in winter. That is the office. He is not going out alone tonight, and he is not going out with friends. He is going out with a firm. Luke, describing this business, uses a precise word for the relationship between Simon and the sons of Zebedee, and it is not the word for neighbors or companions. It is the word for commercial partners. Men in a joint venture. Mark supplies the other half of the picture. Zebedee had hired men in the boat with him. Employees, which means the operation Simon belongs to runs more than one hull and pays wages, and the image some people carry of a destitute beggar hauling a string from the rocks is simply wrong. This is a small business, but do not swing too far the other way either. The lake and its revenues were not free. Fishing rights in this economy appear to have been leased, licensed, and taxed, with brokers and collectors standing between the man in the water and the man who eats the fish. And a number of historians argue that fishers on this shore were never independent at all, but the bottom link of a chain that took its cut before they ever saw a coin. That reading is argued. It is not proven. The pressure, however, is not in doubt. Josephus puts the annual revenue Antipas drew from this region somewhere in the order of 200 talents. Hold that against a man mending a torn net at dawn, and you have the economics of this shore. The boat goes out, and the light goes entirely, and now you learn the thing that reorganizes everything you assumed about how this man lived. The heavy work happened at night. Not because these men were romantics, because the fish could not see the net. The great seine, the dragnet, the one that needs a crew and 2 hulls, and coordination shouted across black water, was worked in the dark, laid in a long arc and hauled closed, and the entire point of the exercise was that the shoal never knew it was there. So Simon's day is inverted from yours. The village sleeps and he works. The village wakes, and he comes in exhausted. Whatever you have imagined about a fisherman's life, run the clock backwards. And out there on the water, in the dark, comes the part nobody puts in a painting. Sometimes there is nothing. You get this twice in the Gospels, and both times it is stated flatly as ordinary. In Luke's account of the great catch, Simon tells Jesus they worked the whole night and took nothing. Years later, in John's final chapter, the same men are on the same water, and the night produces the same result. Empty. 2 separate writers, 2 separate occasions, and neither of them presents it as remarkable. It is just what happens. You go out, you work in the cold and the dark, you haul, the water gives you nothing, and you come in at dawn with ruined hands and no wages. and you will do it again tonight. Now count how many of those nights there were. We are looking at a man who did this for the greater part of his adult life. And notice carefully that Scripture never once tells us his age. Not here and not anywhere else, so anyone who hands you a number is guessing. But the arithmetic of the trade doesn't need a number. Thousands of nights, most of them uneventful, many of them wasted, all of them unrecorded. Let me stop here and ask you something directly, because this is the stretch of his life the Bible walks straight past, and I think it is the part most of us are actually standing in. What is the ordinary, unwitnessed work you are doing right now that you have quietly decided does not count? The job nobody is watching. The years you assume are the waiting room before your real life starts. The repetition you would be embarrassed to describe out loud because it sounds like nothing. I would like to know what yours is. Put it in the comments. I read them, and I have a strong suspicion this video is about to fill up with people describing the most important years of their lives without realizing it. Because that is precisely what these nights were. Dawn comes up behind the eastern heights, the boats come in, and the second half of the working day begins. The half nobody ever thinks about. The net comes out of the water heavy. Wet rope, wet mesh, and whatever the lake decided to hand you, dragged up onto the stones and spread flat. And then the sorting starts. Hold on to the sorting, because it is the single most repeated physical act of this man's life. Jesus will describe it later in a parable with total technical accuracy. A dragnet let down into the sea, gathering fish of every kind, hauled up onto the beach, and then the good collected into containers and the bad thrown away. Every listener on that shore knew the motion in their own hands before he finished the sentence. But the sorting was not only commerce. It was law. Leviticus is explicit. Of everything that lives in the water, only what has fins and scales may be eaten. Everything else is off the table, not merely unappetizing but forbidden. And this lake produces fish without scales. The catfish that come up in a Galilean Seine are exactly that. So when Simon knelt on wet stones in the first gray light and moved his hands through a heaving pile of fish, he was not grading merchandise. He was performing a judgment. Clean here, unclean there. Permitted into the basket, forbidden back into the water. He did that every morning of his working life, thousands upon thousands of times, until the distinction was no longer a rule he remembered but a reflex living in his fingers. Sit with that a moment. The hands that will one day be given the keys of the kingdom spent 20 years separating the clean from the unclean, and got so practiced at it they could do it half asleep. I am not going to explain that to you. Let it sit. Then the sorting ends, and the mending begins, and Mark hands you a picture of it in a single word. When Jesus walks past the sons of Zebedee, they are in the boat working on their nets, and the verb means putting right, restoring, repairing, not casting, fixing. A seine net is enormous and fragile at the same time. It snags on rock and tears on driftwood, and every tear is money, and every tear has to be closed by hand, thread by thread, with a needle. Bone needles and bronze needles have come out of the ground around this lake, along with the lead weights that once ran along the net's bottom edge, and the stone anchors that held boats through the night. The equipment survived. We are not imagining any of this, so picture him in the morning sun with a needle. This is the majority of the daylight hours of the man who will one day preach at Pentecost. Sitting on a beach, hands cracked from salt, closing a hole in a net so that tonight he can go out and probably catch nothing. By mid-morning, What he did catch is moving up into the town. And here you meet the reason Capernaum exists as anything more than a cluster of houses. This village sits on a border. The territory of Herod Antipas ends near here. Across the water and up the Jordan begins the territory of his half-brother Philip. And a road runs through toward Damascus. Where borders and roads meet, governments put a desk, and Capernaum has one. A customs post, with a man sitting at it whose job is to take a cut of everything that moves. That is why the Gospels mention, entirely in passing, a tax collector at his booth in this specific town, and why there is an officer stationed here with soldiers under him. Simon knows that desk. He has walked past it with a basket on his shoulder more times than he could count. He knows the man at it by name, and he almost certainly resents him, for the entirely practical reason that collectors in this system took their living out of yours. And you already know what is coming, so I will say it once and leave it, because it belongs to another story. The man at that desk is going to end up at the same table as him. This whole border town economy, with its tolls and its resentments, is going to be dissolved from the inside by an invitation. But not yet. Today he simply pays. Past the customs post, the town does its business. Barley bread, olives, oil, lentils, onions, dried figs in season, wine cut with water. Meat almost never. There is a spring, and houses, and an assembly, and perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 people. And by any measure that matters to the wider world, this place is nothing. Meanwhile, 6 miles down the coast, Antipas has just finished raising a brand new capital on this same lake. Tiberias, built in the 20s and named to flatter the emperor, and constructed, Josephus tells us, partly over a burial ground, which gave observant Jews every reason to stay out of it. So within Simon's own lifetime, the lake acquires a gleaming administrative city he probably never wanted to enter, and the pressure on every boat working the water goes up. And then he goes home. Home is one of those basalt clusters. There is a woman in it, whose name we are never told. His wife, who was real, who is not a footnote, and about whom the New Testament preserves exactly one later detail. Paul mentions in passing that Cephas traveled with a believing wife. That is all we have. 20 years of a marriage, and a single clause in a letter about the rights of apostles. Her mother is in the house too. Mark tells us so in the middle of a sentence about a fever, and that one aside gives you the whole domestic arrangement. An extended household under one roof, 3 generations in a couple of rooms opening onto a shared yard. She is the one who will be lying sick when a stranger walks in. And here is where a great many reconstructions of this man go wrong. They give you the fish and the stones and the smoke, and then they leave the house spiritually empty, as though these were rough men who happened to live near a religion. They were not. The words of the Shema were said in that house. The command in Deuteronomy is to teach these words to your children, to speak them when you sit and when you walk, when you lie down and when you rise, and to write them on the doorposts of the house. That was not a temple ritual for professionals 160 kilometers to the south. It was spoken at the door of a fisherman's home in the dark before he went out. He wore the law as well. Numbers commands tassels on the corners of the garment as a memory device so that a man looks down and remembers. He wore them at work, soaked, hauling a net. And there was stone in the house, not only in the walls, in the vessels. Archaeologists keep pulling chalk stone cups and jars out of 1st century Galilean sites, turned in dedicated workshops, and the reason they exist at all is legal. Stone was held not to contract ritual impurity, unlike pottery, which had to be broken if it was defiled. John's Gospel mentions 6 stone water jars standing ready at a Galilean wedding for exactly this purpose. which means the people in these villages were spending money on stone because of the law. Purity was not an abstraction out here. It was an object on the shelf. So assemble the picture properly. A man whose hands sorted clean from unclean at dawn, who wore reminders of the commandments into the water, who said the Shema at a doorway marked with it, who kept stone in the house so his family could eat without defilement. He was not a blank page waiting for a religion to be written on him. He was already soaked in one. Which brings you to the seventh day, when the boats stop. Sabbath in Capernaum means the entire rhythm of the shore falls silent. No nets, no selling, and the village gathers for the assembly, where the scriptures are read aloud and discussed. A word of caution here, because this is where almost every documentary about this town goes wrong. If you have been to Capernaum, or seen a photograph of it, you have seen a beautiful synagogue built of white limestone, pale, carved imported stone standing out sharply against all that black basalt. That building is not from this century. It is from the 4th or the 5th, 300 years too late, and no one in this story ever laid eyes on it. Underneath it, there are basalt foundations that some excavators believe belong to an earlier structure, and that argument is live and unresolved. So what Simon walked into on the Sabbath was, at most, a modest hall of the same black stone as everything else, and possibly nothing more than an assembly of men gathered in a room. He listened there, week after week, year after year, and that is worth pausing over, because of a line in Acts that gets misread constantly. When the authorities in Jerusalem later take his measure, the text says they perceived that he and John were unlettered, ordinary men. That word does not mean illiterate. It means untrained, without formal rabbinic schooling, not a professional. A man running a partnership, paying tolls, assessed for the temple tax, and dealing with brokers was operating in a world of documents and numbers. What he lacked was a diploma, not a mind. What he had instead was 20 years of hearing the scriptures read aloud in a room full of working men. On the one day of the week, nobody was permitted to interrupt. So what was he listening for? Here is where the whole thing turns, because his trade was already in the book. The prophets of Israel used fishing as an image repeatedly. Jeremiah has God announcing that he will send for many fishers to catch a people. Amos warns that they will be taken away with hooks. Habakkuk describes a conqueror dragging men out in a net and rejoicing over the haul. Ezekiel puts a hook in the jaw of the king of Egypt and pulls him out of his own river. Notice what every one of those passages has in common. In the prophets, being fished is a catastrophe. The net is what comes for you when God has run out of patience. Every single time that image appears in the Hebrew Scriptures, it carries judgment, the hook, the drag, the helpless thing hauled out of its element to die on a beach. Simon heard those texts read aloud in a basalt room, with his own equipment in the metaphor, meaning the worst thing in the world. There is one exception, and it is spectacular. In Ezekiel's vision of the river running out from the temple, the water teems with life. And the prophet describes fishermen standing along the shore, spreading their nets, with fish of very many kinds. In the picture of the restored world, there are working fishermen standing in it. Their trade survives into the age to come. And then there is the text that names his own address. Isaiah speaks of the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the northern territories, the ones brought into contempt, the provincial edge of the nation, the district the capital looked down on. And Isaiah says that on that despised ground, the people walking in darkness will see a great light. Capernaum stands in Naphtali, and Matthew, telling this story, makes the connection himself and leaves nothing to inference. he records that Jesus left Nazareth and came and settled in Capernaum by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. He then quotes the Isaiah passage in full. And 5 verses later, he has Jesus walking the shore of that same lake, calling 2 fishermen out of a boat. The prophecy did not point at the temple. It did not point at the schools, or the priesthood, or the capital city. It pointed at this water, this district, these villages of black stone. Simon was not chosen in spite of being a Galilean fisherman from the wrong end of the country. He was standing exactly where the text said the light would land. He simply did not know it yet. And now the waiting is nearly over. Luke gives us the one fixed date in this entire story. In the 15th year of Tiberias, with Antipas ruling Galilee, a man began preaching in the wilderness of the Jordan and calling people to be baptized. And the Jordan Valley runs south out of this very lake. News travels a river valley fast, and Simon's brother went. Andrew, John's Gospel tells us, was one of the Baptist's disciples, which means this fishing family already had someone downriver, listening, waiting for something to happen. They were not a household of men with no expectations. They were watching. Then one day Andrew came back, found his brother, and told him they had found the Messiah. That sentence is the closest thing we possess to a window into Simon's inner life before any of this began. He is not a man ambushed by a stranger on a beach. He is a man who had been listening for that specific news his whole life. And one morning his own brother came running with it. What happens next is told in more than one way, and I am not going to smooth them together for you. John says Andrew brought his brother, and that Jesus looked at him, named him Simon, son of John, and said he would be called Cephas, the Aramaic word for rock, which comes into Greek as Peter. Mark opens with no introduction at all. Jesus walking beside the sea, seeing 2 men casting a net into the water, calling them, and the nets going down. Luke gives a 3rd scene entirely, the boat borrowed as a platform, the order to put out into deep water after a night that had produced nothing, the catch so heavy the nets began to tear. The 2nd boat signaled over, both hulls riding low, and Simon on his knees in the middle of a fortune in fish, asking the man to go away from him, because he was a sinner. 3 accounts. They do not lie flat on top of one another, and pretending otherwise would be a lie told to make a video tidier. What all 3 agree on, without exception, is the setting. A working boat, wet nets, a man in the middle of his ordinary job. And here is the last thing, and then we stop, because everything after this belongs to another story. When he was finally called, he was not called away from the shape of his own life. He was called through it. The one man on that shore who had spent 20 years learning patience in the dark, learning to work a net whose results he could not see, learning to come back the following night after a night of nothing. That was precisely the skill he was handed. Fishers of men, not a poetic flourish, a job description in the only vocabulary he owned, and an inversion of every prophetic text he had ever heard. In Jeremiah and Amos and Habakkuk, the net meant judgment. Now the same image meant rescue, not the hook that drags out, the haul that brings in. The years of unrecorded nights were not the delay before his life. They were the training for it. So look back down the beach one more time at the man with the needle and the torn net, and the name he does not have yet. Nobody was writing any of it down. There was no reason on earth to think that a night of empty nets in a border town, in a province the capital despised, mattered to anything at all. And every single one of those nights was preparation for a morning he could not have imagined. If your own work feels like that right now, I would sit with that a while before deciding what it means. He would tell you the same thing, and he would tell you with cracked hands, "Send this to whoever needs it today. And if you want to keep walking through the first century with us, the towns, the trades, the people the Bible names in half a sentence and then leaves behind, subscribe, and we will keep going." One last question, and it is the one I cannot stop turning over. Of everyone standing on that shore that morning, the partners, the hired men, the tax collector at his desk, the entire working population of Capernaum, why do you think it was him? I will see you on the water.